what's funny is that, like, he asked the question, what's God going to do for me and what I can't do for myself? I mean, maybe as Americans, maybe as people, we enjoy self-sufficiency. We want to be able to do things ourselves, but I'm going to be honest. My wife and I can't wait till the day our kids can make coffee and bring it to us in bed. Man, woo! I mean, if I just stop speaking right now, all of us, Christian or not, could say hallelujah to that, right? That would be fantastic. So we've been saying this in our series. We've got a lot to talk about today, and kind of a short amount of time to get through it. So I want to talk about a couple different things. But I want to talk about our series focus. We've been saying this throughout this series, is that our series focus is we want to discover the news behind all of the noise. And the reason we've been describing it this way is that we understand that our lives are busy. We understand that church can be busy. We understand the Bible is a big book. And oftentimes we look through it and we go, man, it's daunting. It's a big book. I mean, how is all of it relevant to me? Like, what is the big stuff? What's the elevator pitch? If you notice, they're meeting in an elevator. And so in this series, we've been talking about the big headlines of the series. And the reason we're kind of taking the big stuff out and talking about those is because we really do think that when you read those things and when you understand kind of the big overarching narrative of the story, then you're more likely to go back and say, I want to know all the nuances. I want to know all the small things. I want to know how it applies to me and my life. And so we're taking out the big kind of chunks, and we hope, and we really do think that when you understand the big parts of the narrative and the story and how it relates to you, you'll want to go back and you want to say, okay, I want to read the rest of the Bible because I want to know how it's all lived out, how do people do all this sort of stuff, and how does it apply to my life. And so we're in part 4 of this series. And last week, if you look over there, there is a graffiti painting. I did something on stage last week you probably have never seen before. And so if you don't know what that is, I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to go back online and watch it. Sorry about that. But we talked about this idea of sin, the most popular topic in all of humanity, right? And we basically said, look, the problem isn't out there, it's in here. And here's what we said. Sin isn't just a part of our activity. Without Jesus, it's a part of our identity, which is a really hard thing for most people to admit. Because you've maybe said this, or maybe you've heard other people say this, I'm a good person at heart. Have you ever said that? We realized that last week that this is not true in any way, shape, or form without God's help. That people are not inherently good by themselves. That we need a lot of help. And we looked at a guy named Paul. And if there was ever anybody in all human existence, besides Jesus, who could have been considered good from a religious perspective, it was Paul. Paul was born on the right day, to the right part of the world, to the right family. He had the right pedigree. He memorized probably the first 5 books of the Bible called the Torah. Most of us can't remember our own phone number anymore. And he had 5 books memorized. Like, he taught God's law. He went out and was kind of like this amazing person who, or at least he thought, that was doing great works for God. And then he comes to this massive conclusion that he has gotten it wrong all of his life. And what I loved about Paul was it's easy for a religious person to kind of wag their finger at someone else, say, hey, don't do that, don't say that, you shouldn't be that way, I mean, God's out to get you. And Paul turns the camera on himself and he says, look, it's not just about everyone else out there, it's me. And Paul says things like, there is no good in me. I do the things that I do not want to do. I hate some of the things that I do. And he's a follower of Christ. And he gives us this incredible relationship with him because all of us know what that is like. When we say and do things that we go, man, why did I say that? Why did I treat her that way? Why did I do that? What is going on with me? All of us have an instance like that. And Paul brings it out because he says, look, the idea is seated in your heart. It's seated in your heart. And that's the issue we're going to deal with today. Have you ever had someone give you this advice? Just follow your heart. Someone ever said that to you? Like, it's possibly the worst advice that anyone ever could give anybody. And so this is our think about it statement. Is it a good idea to follow your heart? I mean, we've got all sorts of phrases around this. I give my heart to you. Maybe when you find someone that you're in love or you think that you're in love, I remember the first time I brought home someone, to my mom, she basically was just like, no, you got to find someone else. I was like, I'm just following my heart. And my poor mom, she's like, yeah, she's kind of ugly. I was like, geez, what is wrong with you? That's horrible. So I can only tell that story when my mom's not here because she smacks me after service if I do that. So she's not here today. So I give you my heart. We say things like, we need to have a heart-to-heart talk. Have you ever gotten that text message? I mean, it's just doom and gloom from then on. Or maybe something like, hey, I feel it in my heart. It's saying, deep down, the deepest parts of who I am, I feel it there. Or my heart goes out to you. Sometimes when we don't know what to say, this is the best way we can experience or express our desire to connect with someone who's in pain. My heart goes out to you. I'll pray for you. My heart goes out to you. Or what if we say something like, that breaks my heart. It bothers me to the very core of who I am. We use this language around the heart because we think, and I think correctly, that the seat of identity is lodged in our heart. Now, whether or not you're a Christian here today, if you're not a Christian and you think this is the case, I think you're right. In fact, I think God would wholeheartedly agree with you. But there's a catch in this, is the heart is deceptive. In fact, God tells us through one of the people who wrote in the Bible, in Proverbs, he says this, above all else, guard your heart, because for everything you do flows from it. God isn't saying to follow your heart. The writer of this is not saying to follow your heart. He's saying to guard your heart. It's from other people and for other people, as we're going to determine today. Guard your heart. Be aware of what you let into your heart, because you shouldn't just let anything into it. Junk in, junk out. And guard your heart from other people, too, because your heart wants to hurt other people, as we're going to discover here in today's message. Jesus is going to help us understand that. But why would God say that? Because in the heart is where we are, and also in the heart is the problem. So, and here's our key truth for today. We shouldn't follow our heart until our heart is fixed. There is a time where you should follow your heart. You can get there. But without God's help, you should never follow your heart. At least that's what we think. If you're not a Christian, you may disagree with that, but I'm hoping to make a compelling case for that today. So, have you ever gone to the doctors before? You probably have. I do a bunch of dangerous stuff, so it feels like I'm always there. And so, if you've ever gone into a doctor's office before, there's a couple things that happen. You know, they have a table very much like this, and you go in, and usually about one of three things happen. In fact, actually, all three often happen. Maybe not in one visit, but maybe through your time at a doctor's office. Is that you come in, and the doctor does three things. And the first one is a diagnosis. And a diagnosis identifies the problem. So you come in to a doctor's office, you sit at the table, and you kind of are like, okay, here's my problem. And they kind of look at you, and they examine you, and they come to the conclusion, hey, you've got a broken arm. And I know that because normal arm's been like this, and yours is kind of like a star now, which is bad. I don't know if you know that. But you have a broken arm. And so what happens is, he says, look, here's the problem, and identifies the problem first. Well, you don't want it to stay that way. And so the second thing a doctor would do is the prognosis. And it says, hey, here's how the problem will get worse. So the doctor basically says, hey, if you want to continue to have this broken arm, that's fine. I mean, you can high-five people at weird angles for the rest of your life if you really want to do that. But it's going to be bad. It may make you sick. You're going to need to tend to that. And so we can set it here today. We can put a cast on it to make sure the problem doesn't get worse, because if you don't do anything about it, it gets worse. You won't be able to function in life. You can't do all that thing. And then the third one is the cure, is that what's going to provide the solution to the problem. And so, hey, we got to put this in a cast. Just setting is not going to be enough. We got to put it in a cast. You have to make sure you don't do like any housework at all. And some people are like, yes, thank you. I'm going to break my arm every week. You know, but the most important part is to get a scratcher, because that thing's going to get itchy in there. You need to do that as well. All of these three things happen when you go to the doctor. And so today, what I want to do is I want to use these three things to examine our heart, to give a diagnosis, a prognosis, and to talk about the cure. And so today, we're all going to do that together. So congratulations, you're all doctors today. Please wash your hands before we go any further. But this is going to be just one of those things, and you're going to examine your own heart. We're going to talk about some people in the Bible, but this is really going to apply to you and I as well, because this issue of the heart is too impactful to ignore. And honestly, you could pick a bunch of different places in the Bible to find out the answer to this and what we're going to do today. If you were to just flip through and just kind of point your finger anywhere in the Bible, you'd probably run across this. Maybe not in an exact way where they talk about the heart, but all throughout the Bible, this issue that God's people and their heart were not towards Him, directed towards Him, is an issue that is all throughout the Bible. So for today's purposes, I've chosen a place called Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is one of those books that isn't read too much, maybe because it's a prophetic book, and people think of prophecy, and they think, man, it's kind of something that's way out there. And prophecy is just a way of God speaking through a person to tell other people what he thinks and what would happen. And so Ezekiel is this prophet, and today we're going to cover 800 years of history. We're going to kind of go forward and back a couple different places. I'm just going to try to confuse you as much as I can today, which is hopefully not the case. But Ezekiel, he steps into this pivotal time in God's people's lives. So God has been saying over 100 times or more, hey, tune your hearts to me, know me, love me, follow my commands, be with me. And the people kind of just said, they do it for a little while, but honestly, for the most of the time, they say, know what, we're going to do our own thing, God. And God gives Ezekiel this message from him. And he basically says, I want the people to know how bad it is. Because what was happening around Ezekiel's time was there became all of these false prophets. So things are bad for God's people. God's one people was split up into two cities, a northern city and a southern city, and rival nations were coming in, and they were taking their stuff, and they were carrying people off. They were burning their temples. And it was just really bad. And so people were kind of like, God, why is this happening? And he's been telling them, because your heart is not for me. These are the consequences of your actions. And then these false prophets get on the scene, and a couple of them are basically like, don't worry, just fine. It's going to be great. Just have a taco. Everything's going to be great. God's going to rescue us from this. And God says, no, that's not the case. It's worse than you think. And so he sends Ezekiel, and Ezekiel has this really tough job. He's the guy who has to give the bad news that no one wants to hear. And so Ezekiel is given this message that is from God. So God tells them this. He says, for I will take you out of the land of other nations. I will gather you from other countries and bring you back. Why do we need to be brought back? Because we're going to be taken away. God is going to say, look, this is the consequence of your heart not being attuned to me. You will be taken away from this place. And so it says, I will cleanse you. I will sprinkle you clean water on you, and I will make you clean. I will cleanse you from all of your impurities and from all of your idols. And idols is not something that we talk about a lot in our current day culture, but this was a big theme in the book of Ezekiel, because they worshiped dead things that were not the living God. And this is what caused them to tune their hearts to something other than God. And then he says, I will give you a new heart. I mean, God, did you make a mistake? Didn't you give us the right heart when you created us? He says, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you, and I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I mean, God is basically like, you've got the wrong heart, because what has a heart of stone? An idol does. I mean, God's using this probably painful message to go, look, I created you with one of these. It was living, it was pumping blood, it was meant to have your heart attuned to me. And because you have gone and worshiped other things, man, your heart has become stone. And this is your first film. The diagnosis is that, look, without God, our hearts aren't just sick, they are stone. Without God, our hearts aren't just sick, they are stone. And so God's looking around at the people who were supposed to know him and love him and show him to the nations. And he said, you know what? The idols that you worship, they've had more of an effect on you than you think. Your heart is not only not directed towards me, your heart is dead towards me. It may have been the first instance in all of history where someone says, you're dead to me. It could have been here that happened. And God is basically saying, look, your hearts are dead to me. Well, if you fast forward about 600 years or so, Jesus is basically saying the same message. In fact, by the end of today's message, 4 different prophets will have said the same thing. And that's important, because anytime God says it multiple times, you should probably pay attention to what's happening. So God has been examining people's hearts for a long time now. And he's kind of been pointing them out. He's like, look, here's how bad it is. The diagnosis is that your hearts are stone. They're not for me. You need to understand how bad it is. And when Jesus gets on the scene, he does the same thing that all the other prophets has been doing. He's like, look, this is a heart issue. Do you see how bad it is? And he's walking around talking with people, and people begin to challenge him. And one of them seems, at least off the cuff, like a reasonable challenge. Because Jesus had these disciples, and they were doing some things that no one had ever seen before. And so a bunch of religious people come up to Jesus, and they ask a religious question, which Jesus then turns around to them to tell them about the heart issue. So here's what happens. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem, and they asked, hey, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? Why don't they wash their hands before they eat? Now, this seems reasonable. Have you ever seen someone go into the bathroom and not wash their hands, and they come out, and then they shake people's hands? Ugh. I just want to go up to them and just be like, he did not wash his hands. Like, is that weird that I want to do that? Like, oh man, it's so bad. So you get this visual, and they were out helping people, and they were touching lepers, meaning Jesus' disciples were out helping the poor. I mean, they were out, and their hands were probably dirty. And so it seems like a reasonable request. Hey, you should wash your hands before you eat. But Jesus says, no, I see what you're doing here. This is not a cleanliness issue. This is a religious issue. You think that because they're dirty on the outside, that's what God cares about. And then he uses this word. He says, you hypocrites. And a hypocrite, at least in the Greek and in classical sense, was a person who wore two masks. A person who, it was a theater term where they could wear the happy mask at one time and put on the sad mask. And Jesus is saying, look, you're putting on your religious mask right now. You don't actually care about what they're doing. You're trying to put on the religious mask and wag your finger at people because you think that's what God wants. And God doesn't want that. And so Jesus says, you hypocrites. Isaiah, another Old Testament a prophet says this, Isaiah was right about you guys, Jesus says, when he prophesied about you, when God told you his opinion of what he sees in you. These people honor me with their lips, and yet their hearts are far from me. God wasn't talking about the irreligious people. He was talking about the religious people. You think that because you know the right words and you know the commands and you can wag your finger at people that I care about what you have to say, your hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Can you get this? God says, you do worship me, but I reject it because your hearts are not in the worship. You're just going through the motions. They worship me in vain, and their teachings are merely human rules. Jesus quotes this, and he says, look, God didn't say to clean the outside. You said that. You thought it would be good for people to religiously and ceremonially wash their hands because you think the outside is important. But God cares about what's inside, what's in your heart. God didn't say what's on the outside is important. You said that. Here's what God says. But the things that come out of a person's mouth, now Jesus is continuing because they thought, you eat with dirty hands, some dirt could get into your body and you could be defiled. You could be unworthy of being near God. Or you could be in the bathroom a long time. It could be one of those things. But Jesus says, hey, don't worry about all that stuff because the things that come out of a person's mouth, these come from the heart. Don't worry about what you put in. You should be really concerned about what comes out. Because out of the heart come evil thoughts like murder and adultery and sexual immorality and theft and false testimony and slander. These are what defiles a people. It's not what was in there. It's what is coming out. These are what defiles a person. But eating with unwashed hands, that does not defile them. It was worse than that. It wasn't on the outside. It was the inside. So, what's the prognosis here? The prognosis that Jesus is trying to get at is, look, without God, our hearts aren't just dead. They're deadly. Our hearts want to hurt other people because without God, they are filled, as we talked about last week, with sin. If you've ever said, why did I say that to her? Why did I not tell the truth there? Why did I think selfishly? Why did I verbally assault them? Why didn't I give that back? Why didn't I say a kind word? Why did I do something horrible to them when I clearly love them? I mean, the people we hurt the most are the people we love the most. So why is our heart geared towards automatically hurting another person without God's help? Because our hearts aren't just dead, they are deadly without God. They will reach out and harm everyone in your life to hurt them because that is what's deep and dark and in our hearts. And none of us want to admit that. That's why this is so offensive. That's why no one wants to talk about the issue of the heart. That's why we tell people to follow their heart. But when we do that, we're telling people, you should follow your darkest, deepest impulses because they come from in here. And Jesus is saying the exact opposite. It's one of the reasons that Christianity is just far and away different from every other religion in the world, because Jesus tells us the things we don't want to hear, but that we know deep down is true. Now, just to totally mess with your minds again, I'm going to go back in history one more time. So about 600 years before this, a guy named Jeremiah, who was within about 100 years of Ezekiel, and the reason that's important is God is using two different prophets, and more than that, to tell the same narrative story. And anytime God says things a couple different ways, especially with a couple different peoples, it confirms the message that this is what is on God's heart. And so he used another prophet named Jeremiah to talk about the heart. But this is a different thing that God is talking about. The issue is still the heart, but Jeremiah talks about it in a different way. Jeremiah says this, I will give them a new heart. I will give them a heart to know me, and that I am the Lord, and they will be my people, and I will be their God, which is totally fascinating, because around this time in history, people were showing that they were not for God, that they were against God, that their hearts were saying horrible things about God and his people, and their actions lined up with the darkness that was in their hearts. And in the midst of all this, God says, I'm going to choose to be their God. I'm going to choose that they would be my people. And they will return to me with what? With all of their heart. Once I show them how much I love them, they will finally turn their hearts to me. And God says, but it gets better than that. I will make an everlasting covenant with them. It's not going to be their doing, it's going to be my doing, meaning God's. I will never stop doing good to them, even though they don't deserve it. I will inspire them to fear me, and not fear like I don't want to have dad come home and like punish me. A fear is this awe of God. That when we know what's deep and down and dark in our hearts, and God says, I see that and I want you anyways. We're in awe of him. Why would you do that? Why would you want me? Why do you want to love me? Don't you see what's inside? And God says, yeah, it's exactly what I'm here for. And he says, they will fear me, so they will never turn away from me, and I will rejoice in doing them good. And I will assuredly plant them in this land with olive. Now God turns and says, his heart, all of his heart and soul. It's not just that we have a heart problem. It's easy to think, look, if the heart is that bad, I mean, can't we just get some work done? Is it good enough to just get some surgery in here? I mean, have you ever sat on a table like this? I mean, what would it look like for you to go into a doctor and say, my heart needs so much help. Will you cut me open and help me? And God says it's worse than that, because we don't need a heart surgery. We need a heart transplant. God basically says, look, if it was just up to you, and this is your next fill, and it's called the cure, we don't just need a heart surgery, we need a heart transplant. It's so bad in our hearts, and this is totally offensive, and I get it, and it should be, is that God says, look, if it was just up to you, if it was just your heart we were working with and just my heart, the patient will be dead. But God says, I can be the donor. I can do this for you. And Jesus picks up on all this language, because that thing that happened about 600 years before Jesus, he picks that up and he says, this is going to happen here and now. So here's what he said. We just celebrated this. It's called communion. And on Jesus' last day alive, at least in his pre-crucifixion, his last day alive, he chooses to have a meal with his followers, and he brings up this idea of the heart, this new covenant that Jeremiah just talked about. He says this, while they were still eating, Jesus took the bread and he broke it and he gave them thanks and he passed it around to them. He says, this is my body. Take it and eat it. When I go to the cross, my body will be broken for you. And then he passes the cup, and when he took the cup and he blessed it, he given thanks to it, and he said, drink from it, all of you, because this is my blood of the what? The new covenant. The new covenant required a heart transplant. Jeremiah said, in order for the new covenant to happen, you and I needed a new heart and a new spirit within us. We needed new things. We needed God's heart and God's spirit within us. So God performs heart surgery, which is poured out for the forgiveness of many sins. And this was a big deal. Because just within a generation, people would pick up on how important this was. I mean, right after Jesus makes this incredible declaration, he goes out into the garden and he's arrested illegally. He's put on trial illegally at night. And people ridicule him and they smack him and they make him bleed. And then they make him carry his cross. And then he's bloodied and pulpy and he gives his life up on a cross. And then within a generation, people pick up on how important this was. Peter, who was one of Jesus' earliest disciples, actually had a heart for God, and then he took his heart back, and Jesus reinstates him. It's this beautiful, beautiful relationship. And then Peter gets to this place where he's telling everyone else about the magnitude of what God has done for them. And Peter gets to this place, and he says this. He says, fellow Israelites, listen to this. This Jesus guy of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, as you yourselves know. He did those among you. Peter's like, look, this wasn't done in a corner. You know the incredible things that he did that none of us can explain. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. The only tragedy in this was its brutality, not that it happened in the first place, because God already initiated this. And you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. Next slide, please. Thank you. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. God always planned this. And the people hearing this, maybe was going to say the key question that we said earlier is that what's God going to do for me that I can't do for myself? How would God give us a new heart? Today's headline explains is that in order for God to give you and I a new heart, he had to stop his. That was the only way it was possible. See, for you and I, sin would stop our hearts, given just us. But for God, love is what stopped his heart for you.